The fire's nearly out now. Just a few orange points in the ash, pulsing faintly, the way a heartbeat looks when you hold a candle behind your hand. The air has gone cool, and the stars are out in their fullness. And somewhere down by the creek, the water is running the way it's always run, steady and unhurried, carrying whatever the day has given it out toward the flatlands and beyond. I'm grateful you sat with me a while. If you enjoyed this quiet evening, you're always welcome back. Just come find the fire, and I'll have a seat waiting. Rest easy wherever you are tonight. Let the night settle around you the way the dust settles on a still street. Let it all go quiet. Let it all go still. Good night, friends. Evening, friends. The fire's burning low tonight. Just a handful of coals left now, barely enough to throw color on the ground around my boots. But there's warmth still in them, the kind that seeps through slow and stays a while, the way good heat does when it's had time to settle into the earth. I'm glad you've come. Sit close if you like. The night air's got that thin edge to it, even here in late spring, and there's no reason not to share what warmth there is. I always enjoy hearing where folks are listening from. If you'd like, leave a comment and tell me which part of the world you're resting in tonight. And if these quiet western evenings help you unwind, you're always welcome to subscribe and come sit by the fire again. Now then, I was thinking earlier today as I sat out on my porch and watched the afternoon go wide and gold across the valley. I was thinking about dust. Not dust in any grand sort of way. Not dust as something poetic or heavy with meaning. Just dust. The plain kind. The kind that lifts off Main Street when a gust catches it right, swirls up for a few seconds like it's got somewhere to be, and then gives up, drifts back down, and settles into every crack and seam it came from. There was a day I remember, spring of 1888, when the dust did exactly that, and not much else happened at all. And somehow, that day has stayed with me longer than most. I was the deputy then, still young enough that my knees didn't pop when I stood from a chair, though old enough that I'd stopped trying to prove anything to anybody. Sheriff Lyle Hargrove ran the office, a quiet man with hands the size of saddlebags, and a way of speaking that made you feel like he was always just about to say something important, even when he was only commenting on the weather. He'd gone out that morning to check on the Ritter homestead. Their well had been giving them trouble, and Lyle was the sort who considered such things part of his duty, even though no one had asked him to. So, I was alone at the jail, which was not uncommon and not unwelcome. The jail in Cottonwood Creek was a small building, nothing much to speak of. 2 cells in the back, both empty, more often than not. A desk near the front window where the light came in during mornings. A pot-bellied stove in the corner that we kept cold from April to October. And a porch. That porch was the real office, if I'm being honest. 2 steps up from the packed dirt street, a rail that had been sanded smooth by years of arms and elbows leaning against it, and a roof overhang just deep enough to keep the sun off your hat brim at midday. That's where I spent most of my hours, and that morning was no different. I'd brought my chair out early, just after sunrise, when the air still had that coolness to it, the kind you can taste at the back of your throat if you breathe in slow. It's a particular quality, that early morning desert air. It carries something the afternoon burns away. A cleanness, maybe, or a kind of patience. The town was barely awake. I could hear Henry Coulter's rooster going on about something 3 streets over. That bird never did learn when to stop. And somewhere down past the livery, a dog barked once, twice, then gave it up. The sky was pale, almost white near the horizon, deepening into blue as it climbed, and there wasn't a single cloud anywhere I could see. I tipped my chair back, set my boot heels on the lower rail, and let the morning be what it was. There is a certain kind of pleasure in having nowhere to go and nothing that can't wait, and I had learned by then not to feel guilty about it. Lyle had taught me that, in his roundabout way. A lawman who can't sit still, he'd said once, is a lawman looking for trouble he doesn't need. I took that to heart. I sat still, plenty. The boardwalk planks under my chair had been warped by years of weather. I could feel the slight bow of them through the legs of the chair, a faint unevenness that had become familiar. The way the uneven floorboards in your own home stop being imperfections and start being landmarks. There was a nail near my left boot that had worked itself up a 1/4 inch above the wood. I'd been meaning to hammer it back down for weeks and hadn't gotten around to it. It caught the light when the sun hit it right, a tiny bright point in the gray wood. And I'd taken to noticing it each morning the way you notice a freckle on your own hand, not with any real thought, just with recognition. The first few hours passed the way they always did. A wagon came through, loaded with cut timber from the mill east of town, the driver lifting 2 fingers off the reins in greeting as he passed. I raised my hand in return. Mrs. Adeline Fossey swept the steps of the dry goods store across the street, the broom making that soft, rhythmic hush against the planks, a sound so regular it could have been a heartbeat. Her cat, a fat orange thing with 1 torn ear, sat on the windowsill and watched her work with the kind of judgment only cats seem capable of. Farther down the street, I could see Jonas Pruitt opening the doors of the livery, swinging them wide and latching them to the hooks set in the outer wall. The smell of hay and horse and old leather drifted up the street in faint ribbons, carried on whatever small currents of air were moving through town. I had my coffee beside me, in the tin cup I'd owned since before I took the badge. The enamel was chipped along the rim, worn through to bare metal in 2 places, and the handle had been bent straight and rebent so many times it no longer matched the curve of any particular hand. But it held coffee, and that was enough. I drank it slow. There was no reason to drink it any other way. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed high enough to push the shadow line back to the wall behind me. The porch roof still kept the glare off, but I could feel the warmth of the day building, that slow accumulation of heat that the desert does so well, adding degree upon degree until the air above the street began to shimmer, and the horses at the hitching rails stood with their heads low, tails flicking at nothing in particular. The boardwalk planks had gone from cool underfoot to warm, and the dust on Main Street had dried to that fine, pale powder that puffs with every footfall. It was around that time, maybe 10 o'clock, maybe a little after, that the wind came. Not a storm wind, not even a proper breeze, really. Just a gust, a single breath of moving air that came from somewhere out on the flats to the west and pushed through the gaps between the buildings like water through a sieve. It caught the dust on Main Street and lifted it. Not high, just knee-level at most. A low curtain of pale gold that swept east along the street in a rolling wave. It passed in front of the dry goods store, dimmed the colors of the sign above the barber shop, whispered against the legs of the horses tied to the rail outside the saloon, and then, as quickly as it had come, it let go. The dust hung for a moment, suspended in that warm, still air, each particle catching the light like something almost too fine to see. And then it fell, slowly, gently. It settled back onto the street, onto the boardwalks, onto the window ledges and porch rails, into the cracks between the planks and the gaps beneath the doors. Everything that had been disturbed returned to where it was, and the street was still again. I watched the whole thing from my chair. I don't know why it held my attention the way it did. It was nothing. A gust of wind and some dust. But there was something in the completeness of it, the lifting and the falling, the disturbance and the return, that made me set my coffee down and just watch. The way you watch a bird land on a fence post, not because it matters, but because it's there, and you're there, and for a moment, those two facts seem like enough. I tapped the porch rail with my knuckle, a habit I had, something I did without thinking, the way some men drum their fingers on a table or click their tongue when they're turning a thought over. The rail gave back a dull, solid sound, the sound of dry pine that's been baked by years of sun. I tapped it again. Then I stopped and just listened. The town had that after-gust quiet, the hush that follows any small interruption. Mrs. Fossey had paused in her sweeping and was looking up the street, one hand shading her eyes, as if she expected the wind to come back and try again. It didn't. She went back to her broom. The cat on the windowsill hadn't moved at all. There is a rhythm to a small town that you only learn if you stay in one long enough. It's not the rhythm of clocks or schedules, though those exist too. It's something underneath that, something slower and less precise. It's the rhythm of doors opening and closing at roughly the same times each day, of the blacksmith's hammer starting up after breakfast and going quiet in the early afternoon when the heat makes the forge unbearable, of children's voices spilling out of the schoolhouse at noon and then fading as they scatter home for lunch, of the stagecoach when it runs on time, arriving from the east in a cloud of dust and departing an hour later, lighter by a mailbag and heavier by whatever freight has been loaded. These rhythms layer on top of each other, and after enough years, they become something you carry in your body, the way a sailor carries the motion of the sea even after he steps ashore. I had been in Cottonwood Creek long enough to carry all of it. I knew which floorboard in the general store creaked the loudest. I knew that the church bell rang slightly flat, a defect in the casting that Reverend Alcott had long since stopped apologizing for. I knew that the water trough outside the livery leaked from a hairline crack near the bottom, and that Jonas Pruitt refilled it every afternoon from a bucket he carried from the pump, and that he always spilled some on his boots, and that he always cursed softly when he did, the same word each time, spoken under his breath like a private litany. These are the things that make a place yours, not the deed to a house or the title to a piece of land, just the slow accumulation of knowing. After the dust settled, I decided to walk, not because anything required my attention, but because my legs had been still long enough and the morning was the kind that seemed made for walking through. I set my coffee cup on the rail, stood, felt the familiar creak of the chair as it rocked forward without me, and stepped down off the porch into the street. The dust was soft under my boots. It had that particular consistency that late spring dust gets in the high desert. Fine as flour, dry enough to puff with each step, but with just enough weight to it that it doesn't blow away in anything less than a real wind. I could feel it sift into the seams of my boot leather as I walked, a sensation I'd known since I was a boy and had never learned to mind. I walked east along Main Street, past the dry goods store where Mrs. Fossey had finished her sweeping and gone inside, past the barber shop where old Gus Merkel was sitting in his own chair reading a newspaper that was at least 2 weeks old. He looked up as I passed, nodded once, and went back to reading. Past the bakery where the smell of bread and something sweet, cinnamon, maybe, or molasses, drifted through the open door and mixed with the dry air. Past the feed store, which was closed, its shutters latched, the owner having gone to visit family in Silver Springs and not expected back for another week. Past the little gap between the feed store and the land office, where a narrow alley cut through to the back lots, and where someone had left a wooden crate that was slowly coming apart. In the weather, its slats curling away from the nails like petals from a spent flower. Each step was unhurried. There was nowhere I needed to be, and nothing that needed doing that couldn't be done later, or not at all. This is a freedom that young men don't recognize and old men miss when it's gone. I was somewhere in between, old enough to recognize it, young enough to still have it, and I let myself sink into the slow pleasure of a walk with no destination. At the east end of Main Street, where the buildings thinned out and the road turned to a rutted track that wound off toward the foothills, I stopped. The view from there was one I knew well. The long slope of the valley floor running out toward the low hills, the scrub brush dotting the landscape in muted greens and grays, the line of cottonwood trees along the creek that gave the town its name, their leaves pale and new in the spring light, flickering silver when the air moved. Beyond the hills, the mountains stood blue and hazy, their peaks still carrying the last traces of winter snow that would be gone by June. The sky above them was enormous, the kind of sky that makes you feel both very small and very much a part of something. I stood there for a while. A hawk circled high overhead, riding the thermals in wide, lazy spirals, its wings barely moving. I watched it until my neck got stiff, then looked back down at the road. The ruts were deep from the spring rains, dried now into hard ridges that would jar a wagon, something fierce. I could see the twin lines of them stretching out into the distance, narrowing to a point where the road crested a rise and disappeared over the other side. Somewhere out that way, miles and miles along that road and others like it, the world kept going. Other towns, other people, other lives being lived in their own slow rhythms. But I didn't feel the pull of any of it. Cottonwood Creek was where my boots had found their rest, and I was content with that. I turned and walked back the way I'd come. The sun was higher now, the shadows shorter, the heat more insistent. I could feel it on the back of my neck and along the tops of my shoulders, a steady pressure that wasn't unpleasant, but reminded me that shade would be welcome before long. The street was a little busier than it had been. A couple of horses tied at the rail in front of the saloon. A farm wagon parked outside the general store with a boy sitting on the tailgate, swinging his legs. He was maybe 8 or 9, with a hat too big for his head that kept sliding down over his eyes. He'd push it back up, sit still for a moment, and then it would slide down again. I watched this happen 3 times as I walked past, and each time it struck me as quietly funny, the way certain small repetitions do when you're in the right frame of mind. I checked the door of the land office as I passed, not because I expected it to be open, but because checking doors was part of the work, and I had long since stopped separating the work from the walking. The latch was secure, the shutters were latched, everything was as it should be. I moved on to the feed store, tried that door too, found it locked, and continued down the street. At the barber shop, Gus had set down his newspaper and was stropping a razor against a leather belt hung from the arm of his chair, the slow, rhythmic pull and turn of it making a sound like a whisper with an edge. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. The jail was ahead, and I could see my chair on the porch where I'd left it, and the tin cup on the rail, and the shadow of the roof overhang lying across the planks like a drawn line. I climbed the 2 steps, settled back into the chair, and picked up my coffee. It had gone lukewarm, which was fine. Lukewarm coffee is still coffee, and I've never been the kind to fuss over temperature when the taste is still there. It was from that chair, maybe 20 minutes later, that I saw the rider. He came from the west, from the direction of the open flats. And he came slowly, not the slow of caution, and not the slow of fatigue. Though he may have been tired, I couldn't tell at that distance. It was the slow of a man who had set his pace somewhere back along the road and saw no reason to change it. His horse was a gray, tall and long-legged, walking with that easy, loose-jointed gait that certain horses have, the kind that covers ground without appearing to hurry. The rider sat deep in the saddle, his shoulders slightly forward, his hat brim low. He wore a long coat, despite the warmth, the color of it somewhere between brown and the dust it was covered in, and I could see the shape of saddlebags behind the cantle, full but not bulging. He came up Main Street at that same unhurried pace, the horse's hooves making soft, regular sounds in the dust, not the sharp clop of hard-packed ground, but the muffled thud of dry earth giving way and closing back. Dust rose around the horse's legs in small puffs, each one catching the light for an instant before falling away. I watched him the way I watched everything that came through town, which is to say, without urgency and without suspicion, but with attention. A deputy learns to watch, not the sharp, nervous watching of a man expecting trouble, but the steady, patient watching of someone who understands that most of what passes through a town is ordinary, and that the ordinary deserves as much notice as anything else. You learn more from watching a man ride through town without stopping than you do from watching a man who stops and announces his business. The first tells you something true about his nature. The second only tells you what he wants you to know. This rider did not stop. He did not slow, did not speed up, did not glance at the buildings on either side of the street or at the people going about their business. He looked straight ahead, not with the fixed stare of someone avoiding eye contact, but with the easy forward gaze of a man who knew where he was going and was simply going there. His hands were loose on the reins. His posture was relaxed. The gray horse moved through the town the way a creek moves through a meadow, following the path of least resistance, unhurried, indifferent to the landscape on either side. As he passed the jail, I got a better look at him. He was neither young nor old, somewhere in that middle ground where the sun has begun to leave its marks, but hasn't yet carved them deep. His face was lean, weathered in the way of men who spend their days outdoors, and there was dust in the creases around his eyes and in the stubble along his jaw. His coat was travel-worn, the fabric thinned at the elbows and along the seams, but it had been a good coat once, well made, the kind a man invests in when he knows he'll be wearing it for years. The saddlebags were the same, good leather, well used, the buckles tarnished, but still solid. He didn't look at me. I didn't expect him to. Some riders acknowledge the towns they pass through, and some don't, and neither choice tells you much on its own. I tapped the rail once, that unconscious habit, and watched him continue east along the street, past the barber shop and the bakery and the feed store, growing smaller with distance, until he was just a dark shape against the pale road. And then the road bent, and the cottonwoods swallowed him, and he was gone. The dust his horse had raised drifted for a moment in a still air, a thin veil that caught the sunlight and turned it amber. And then it settled. Everything settled. The street was as it had been before he came, and if I hadn't been sitting there watching, there would have been no sign he'd passed through at all. I thought about that for a while. Not about the rider himself. I had no thoughts about him, no curiosity about where he'd come from or where he was going. Those were his affairs, and I had learned long ago that other men's destinations are not my concern unless they give me reason to make them so. What I thought about was the way a town absorbs a passing. The dust rises and falls. The sound of hooves fades. The space a man occupied fills back in with silence and stillness. And the town goes on as if nothing had changed, because nothing has. A town like Cottonwood Creek has a kind of patience that way. It doesn't reach out to hold what passes through. It lets things come and go with the same quiet acceptance it gives to weather. The noon hour came on gradually, the way it does in the desert, not with any sharp signal, but with a slow intensification of heat and light, until the shadows pull in tight against the bases of the buildings, and the air above the street goes thick and shimmering. I could feel the planks of the porch warm through the soles of my boots. The tin cup on the rail had gone hot to the touch. I picked it up, drained the last of the coffee. It was barely a swallow, and it was the temperature of bath water, but I drank it anyway and set the cup back down. Across the street, Mrs. Foss's cat had retreated from the windowsill to somewhere inside, where it was cooler. The boy on the wagon tailgate had gone too, probably called in by his mother or sent on some errand. The street was nearly empty, which was usual for the hottest part of the day. Cottonwood Creek went quiet at noon the way a hand closes, gradually, gently, until everything was gathered inward and still. I thought about going inside, where the thick walls of the jail kept the air a few degrees cooler, but I didn't. There was something about the midday stillness that I didn't want to leave. It had a quality to it that's hard to describe. Not silence exactly, because there were still sounds. The creak of a sign swinging on its hinges down the street. The distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, slow and irregular. The sound of a man working without enthusiasm in the heat. The buzz of a horsefly circling the hitching rail. These sounds didn't break the stillness so much as define it, the way the banks of a river define the water without stopping its flow. I let my hat brim drop lower over my eyes and watched the street through the narrow gap between the brim and my brow. The world became a thin band of light and dust, and the slow movement of heat rising from the ground. My breathing slowed. Not sleep. I wasn't sleeping, though a man might have been forgiven for thinking so. But something adjacent to it, a loosening of attention that let the afternoon wash over me like shallow water over a flat stone. I was thinking, in that loose, unfocused way, about the morning's gust of wind, about how the dust had risen and fallen, about how the street had absorbed the disturbance and returned to itself without effort or hesitation. It seemed to me, and this is the kind of thought that only comes when you're sitting still and the heat has sanded down the edges of your mind. It seemed to me that there was a lesson in that, if you were inclined to look for lessons, which I generally was not. But the thought drifted through anyway, the way clouds drift, and I let it pass without trying to hold it or shape it into something it didn't want to be. The afternoon unfolded in its own time. I got up once to refill my water from the pump behind the jail. The handle was stiff and squealed when I worked it, a sound that scattered a pair of sparrows from the eave above, and I stood in the small yard behind the building and drank from the dipper. The water cold enough to make my teeth ache. The pump's shadow lay across the hard-packed earth like a dark finger pointing east. I watched it while I drank, not thinking about anything in particular, just watching the way the shadow's edge wavered slightly in the heat, as if the air itself were breathing. Back on the porch, I took up my position again. The afternoon light had shifted, coming now from a lower angle that threw long shadows across the street and turned the dust to gold. The buildings on the west side of the street were lit up bright, their false fronts glowing in the warm light, while the east side had fallen into shade. The contrast made the street look like two different places, one bright and open, the other cool and hidden, divided by an invisible line that moved slowly eastward. As the sun moved west, Lyle came back around 3. I heard his horse before I saw him, the familiar heavy tread of that big bay of his, and then he appeared at the west end of the street, riding at an easy walk. He pulled up in front of the jail, swung down, and tied the bay to the rail with the kind of practiced automatic motion that doesn't require thought. His hat was pushed back, and there was dust in the lines of his face, and he looked tired, the way a man looks tired when he's been doing honest work under a hot sun. "How's the Ritter?" "Well?" I asked. He climbed the steps and leaned against a rail, arms crossed. "Sand in the line," he said. "Took most of the morning to clear it." He looked up the street, squinting. "Anything happen here?" I thought about the gust of wind and the dust and the rider on the gray horse. "Not much," I said. He nodded, as if that was exactly the answer he'd expected, and went inside. I heard him settle into his chair, heard the creak of the desk drawer opening and the clink of the water jug against a glass. After a minute, I heard nothing at all, and I knew he'd leaned back and closed his eyes, the way he always did after a long morning's work. Lyle could fall asleep anywhere, a talent I envied, but had never managed to cultivate. The afternoon continued its slow unwinding. I left the porch once more, this time to walk down to the livery and check on my own horse, a roan mare named Pepper, who had been with me for 6 years and who greeted me with the same expression, every time. A look that suggested she was mildly surprised I'd come and mildly indifferent to the fact. I gave her an apple I'd been keeping in my coat pocket, and she took it with a delicate, precise motion of her lips, her breath warm against my palm. The apple was gone in 3 bites, and she turned her head away, back to the hay in her stall, dismissing me with a swish of her tail. Jonas Pruitt was in the back of the livery, mending a piece of harness. He had the leather laid across his knee and was working a needle through it with the slow, careful stitches of a man who has repaired many things and knows that rushing only means doing it twice. We exchanged a few words about the weather, about the Ritter well, about nothing. And then I left him to his work and walked back up the street. The shadows were long now, stretching all the way across the road and climbing the fronts of the buildings on the west side. The air had begun to cool, that first faint hint of evening that comes before the sun touches the horizon, a softening of the light that changes everything without changing anything you can point to. The dust on the street had taken on a warmer color, almost copper, and the sky above the rooftops was beginning to deepen from blue to something richer, something with weight to it. I stopped in the middle of the street, not for any reason, just stopped, stood there with my boots in the dust, and looked around at the town, at the buildings with their weathered wood and painted signs, at the hitching rails and water troughs, at the boardwalks and the porches, at the windows beginning to glow with lamplight as the day wound down. It was all familiar. Every board, every nail, every warped plank and leaning post. I knew this place the way I knew my own hands, not with the knowledge that comes from study, but with the knowledge that comes from use, from years of walking these streets and leaning against these rails and breathing this air. A small gust of wind came through, just like the one that morning. A single breath from the west that caught the dust and lifted it, swirled it ankle high for a moment, and then let it go. It settled. The street was still. I stood there a little longer, feeling the last warmth of the day on my face, and then I walked back to the jail and climbed the steps and sat down in my chair and watched the evening come in. It came the way it always did, not all at once, but in layers. The gold fading to amber, the amber deepening to copper, the copper giving way to a dusky purple that spread from the east like water filling a basin. The first star appeared low on the horizon, faint and tentative, as if it wasn't sure whether the sky was ready for it yet. Then another, and another, and then the whole dark canopy was beginning to fill with them, and the day was done. Lyle came out onto the porch as the last light was fading. He stood beside me, hands in his pockets, and looked out at the darkening street. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Quiet day." Yes, I said. It was. He went back inside. I heard him banking the stove, though we wouldn't need it. Habit, I suppose, the kind of thing a man does because he's always done it. I stayed on the porch a while longer, watching the lamplight from the windows across the street make soft squares of gold on the dust. Somewhere south of town, a coyote called. A single wavering note that hung in the air like a thread of smoke, then faded. Another answered from farther off, fainter, an echo of an echo. Then silence. I thought again about the dust. about the way it had risen that morning, caught the light, drifted for a moment as if unsure whether to keep going or turn back, and then settled. And I thought about the rider on the gray horse, passing through without stopping, leaving nothing behind but hoofprints that the next gust would erase. And I thought about how the street had accepted both the wind and the rider, the disturbance and the departure, with the same untroubled stillness, the way a pond accepts a stone dropped into its center, rippling outward for a moment and then going smooth again. That is the nature of a place like Cottonwood Creek. It does not hold on to what passes through. It does not mourn what leaves or celebrate what arrives. It simply continues, day after day, season after season, with a steadiness that has nothing to do with stubbornness and everything to do with knowing what it is. The buildings age, the paint peels, the boardwalks warp and are replaced and warp again. But the town remains, not because it resists change, but because it absorbs it so completely that the change becomes part of the place itself, indistinguishable from what was there before. I've lived here most of my life, and I expect I'll live here for the rest of it. That's not a boast or a complaint. It's just a fact, the same kind of fact as the dust being dry or the creek running clear. Some men are made for the road, for the long ride between towns, for the next horizon and the one after that. I was made for the porch, for the chair and the rail and the slow parade of days that look alike but never quite are. That evening, after I'd locked the jail and walked home to my own small house at the south end of town, I sat on my own porch for a while before going in. The night was warm and still, and the sky was thick with stars, and I could hear the creek down below the bluff running soft and steady over its bed of smooth stones. A lamp was burning in the Hollisters' window next door, and I could see the shape of Mrs. Hollister moving behind the curtain, probably tidying up after supper. Down the street, the saloon was lit up, the sound of a piano drifting faintly through the open door. Not a song exactly, just someone running their fingers over the keys in no particular pattern, a sound that was more like thinking out loud than playing. I unlaced my boots and set them beside the door. The leather was covered in a fine layer of dust, the same dust that had risen and fallen that morning, the same dust that covered everything in Cottonwood Creek by the end of each day and was swept away each morning, only to return by evening. I brushed it off with my hand, felt the grit of it against my palm, and thought that there was something honest about dust. It doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. It comes from the ground, and it returns to the ground, and in between, it catches the light. Inside, I lit the lamp on the table and sat down to write in the ledger. This was a habit I'd kept since my first year as deputy. A simple record of each day, nothing elaborate, just a line or two noting anything that had happened, or more often noting that nothing had. I opened the book to the next blank line and dipped my pen. The ink was low in the well, and I made a note to buy more the next time the supply wagon came through. Then I wrote the date, May the 14th, 1888, and beside it, in my careful, unhurried hand, I wrote, Wind from the west mid-morning. Dust rose and settled. One rider passed through, heading east, did not stop. Fair weather, no incidents. I looked at what I'd written. It was, by any measure, a record of nothing. A gust of wind, some dust, a man on a horse, And yet, sitting there in the lamplight with the ledger open before me and the quiet of the house settling around me like a blanket, it felt complete. It felt like a day fully, not because anything remarkable had happened, but because I had been present for all of it, for the dust and the wind and the rider, and the slow turning of the light from morning to evening, for the creak of my chair and the taste of lukewarm coffee and the sound of a broom on a boardwalk, and the silence that came after. There are days that lodge in memory like a splinter, sharp and insistent, demanding attention. And there are days that settle in like sediment, so gradually that you don't notice them until years later, when you find them layered at the bottom of your thoughts, quiet and undisturbed. That day, the day the dust rose and fell again, was one of the latter. It asked nothing of me. It offered nothing extraordinary. It simply happened, the way most days do, and I was there for it, and that was enough. I closed the ledger. I turned down the lamp. I went to bed. The sheets were cool against my skin, and the window was open, and the night air came in, carrying the scent of sage and the faint sweetness of the cottonwood blossoms that wouldn't last much longer. I could hear the creak steady and constant, and somewhere far off, so far it might have been my imagination, the long, low whistle of a train. Not our train, we didn't have one, but the Southern Pacific line that ran through the valley 40 miles south, its sound carrying across the flats on still nights like a ghost of somewhere else. I lay there and let the sounds layer over me. The creak, the distant train, the soft tick of the house settling, the faint, far-off yip of a coyote, answered by silence. My breathing slowed. The day released its last hold on me, the way a hand opens, finger by finger, until what it held is simply gone. Now, friends, that's what I was remembering tonight as I sat here beside this fire, watching the coals go dim. A day when the dust rose and fell. A rider who passed through and kept going. A street that absorbed it all and went on being what it was. Not much of a story, I suppose, but it's mine, and I've carried it all these years without knowing quite why, and tonight seemed like a good night to set it down.